your value offering to your employees and a way of attracting and retaining key talent right from the beginning. That must be part of your initial strategy.
And Paul, as you've noted that share incentive schemes are sort of falling out of favour, are there any innovative sort of new ways of remunerating execs that are coming out of the woodwork now that you're noticing?
So as I think in terms of senior executives, shares will always be a part of that. In a listed company, it's a pure share scheme. In an unlisted company, it might be some sort of phantom share scheme. But at other levels, there are certainly more innovative ways of paying people. And what you try to do is, without actually giving them shares, you try to create the same sort of mindset and incentive with a cash-based scheme. So we typically tend to see a cash-based scheme, but a portion of it gets held back or banked. That might be matched by the company when it comes to payout to provide some extra upside. So you try and give that sort of long-term mindset without some of, if you like, we spoke about the evils of equity from a share option scheme being, and the complexity of that being brought into the design.
How much of a backlash are these getting? Are these options and creations and you know, how much of a backlash are they getting? Because here's a company that is obviously operating in a very difficult environment. Therefore, share prices going down, revenues going down, but you want to retain the CEO, you want to retain this executive team. Right. Therefore, you keep on saying, guys, please stay. Here's more shares, here's more shares. And yet you have a lower staff base that is not getting anything, and they're getting told the same story, that we're operating in a difficult environment, we can't afford these inflation plus 3, 4, 5 salaries.
Right, yeah. So, I mean, there's a couple of points there. The first is the discrepancy between your executive pay and your more junior levels, and that's not really a function of how you pay them, but how much they end up with at the end of the day, and what is fair for that level of job. And that's something you would want to look at. I think the second point is just around the unpredictability of shares. So what we tend to see with share schemes is, if the industry has a bumper year, for example, you're in the oil industry and the oil price goes through the roof, and everyone is on shares, you find enormous wealth is created for a whole lot of employees. But in a different industry, you might have 10 companies that are on a similar scheme, and there's little growth, and the shares end up being worth, you know, very little, and it ends up not motivating anyone. So everyone is disgruntled. So you either have a bumper year and you have some windfall profits, and everyone earns huge bonuses, which then get criticized because the bonuses are excessive, or the share price doesn't move, everyone works, achieves operational objectives, and doesn't get any reward at the end of the day. The share options are underwater, there's pressure to revalue the share options, and it just doesn't reward people appropriately.
We've got about 2 minutes left, and perhaps let's get a comment from Craig before we go. Do you find that unions are open to the idea of equity in companies? Is this a viable option for them as against fighting for disposable income at the end of the month?
Yeah, look, it's difficult to answer for the unions, yeah, but most of your big unions have investment arms, so they're not against the idea of equity as a means of value creation. I think often it's, you know, depending on the constituency that they're serving, whether that constituency has that same long-term horizon, because if you're earning 3,000 Rand a month, your needs tend to be more immediate and short-term, and that is what you're looking at. And so yeah, I think it would again be situation based, but the concept of equity, I think, is not lost on the unions, not at all.
Here's one question I received from one reader. Now, I have stayed for the 5-year period that I've been closed in for this share option scheme. Can I now if I leave the company, can I transfer my share options into actual equity in that company even though I'm no longer part of it?
Well, it depends if that thing has vested. So if they now have unrestricted access to those shares, then they could simply take it and move it to a share portfolio. So move the scrip across from the trust or whatever the structure is into a personal share portfolio and keep those shares. Or depending if the rules say they have to sell out and take the cash value. So again, it would depend on how it's been structured, but they certainly have that option.
Unfortunately, I have to wrap this conversation as well. Thank you so much for your insights. It's really interesting as a retention and attraction vehicle, whether these options are actually viable. Thanks again to our guest, Paul Hunter, Senior Consultant at Hay Group, and Craig Gradridge, Director of Investments at Gradridge Mahura Investments. Time now to look at our Befriend the Trend. In this week, Befriend the Trend, we get into a completely different kind of trend, startups in Canada. Now, Tandi, why would I, as a South African entrepreneur, consider packing up my bags, taking my amazing, innovative idea from South Africa and going to plant it in Canada?
Maybe let me start off by saying it might be a trend that other guys may want to follow, but it might be a trend that other guys may actually say, actually, I would rather keep my business here. But there are pros and cons. And the pros in this case, so the government of Canada has created what they call a startup visa program. Now, this allows young entrepreneurs and innovative businessmen in South Africa who are in software development and IT to move to Canada. Now, the advantage is it's a much bigger IT market in North America than what we have in South Africa.
Right.
But also then the government will give you citizenship, but you must have gone to college for about a year. You must have raised about 200,000 Canadian dollars, which is about 1.9 million rand.
Right.
But I think the point is you get access to a much bigger market. You get support, you get investors that are ready to take your business to the next level. So the argument is, why would you then take your skills? Why would you take your ideas to grow another market?
Well, from a job creation point of view, because I'm assuming these are all people who have the potential to create jobs in Canada, isn't this a trend that the South African government should be befriending?
Absolutely. If you look at the Canadian statistics, they're expecting that if this goes well and takes off very well, they could create well over 1.6 million jobs in about the next 10 years. Now, it's all about the will of the government to say, actually, we're not opposed to going to the world and saying, these are the skills and businesses that we need. If you're sitting somewhere out there and you have these skills and you have this business, we can make the environment possible and conducive for you to come and bring your business to our country, and we can help you grow it to the next level.
A direct message from Tandisizwe to the Minister of Labour, to the Minister of, in the Department of Trade and Industry. You should be befriending this trend. Time now to get a refresher, but we'll be back with some top insights right after this. Stay tuned to CNBC Africa. Welcome back. Now, the recently updated broad-based Black Economic Empowerment Codes have come under much scrutiny in the last few weeks. Business and government appear to be at loggerheads in terms of expectations, and this is creating a lot of uncertainty. As we attempt to unpuzzle the riddle, we're joined by Seth Randall, Executive at Empowered, and Eric Ackroyd, Verification Director at Empower Logic. Clearly very empowered guys at the desk this morning. Thank you so much for making the time to join us. Perhaps let me come to you first, Seth. What's the most significant change in these new codes that is worth noting?
I think the largest thing is that there have been some whole-scale changes to the targets, as well as the creation of 3 priority elements. Failure to meet any of the sub-minimums for the 3 priority elements will result in a company having their scorecard downgraded a level. And so I think that really strikes at the core of what will become a lot harder for companies.
Can we speak English?
Sure.
What are those elements?
Okay. So essentially a scorecard on the broad-based Black Economic scorecard previously was measured on 7 elements.
Right.
Being ownership, management, employment equity, skills development, procurement, enterprise development, and socio-economic development.
Now it's gone down to 5.
It's gone down to 5 now, and 3 of them, the most important 3 essentially, have sub-minimum requirements, and those are ownership, skills development, and what's now called enterprise and supplier development, which is a combination of...
What was the sentiment? What was the push behind changing the way things were?
Essentially, when we went for the BEE Summit, which was the DTI, it was the keynote address was given by Jacob Zuma, and the DTI basically unveiled the codes. Their sentiment was that there were certain things in the previous dispensation that weren't working as well as they wanted to.
Right.
So they felt that too many companies weren't taking some of the elements seriously, such as ownership, and that it was too easy for some companies to score rather high ratings on their scorecard without having any really substantive transformation
so they weren't
taking
reflective
place.
really of what was going on.
Exactly.
I mean, I couldn't help but notice in your first comment that the one that wasn't in English that Thandi was picking up on is that you went into failure to meet these, and it seems as if there's been a lot of negative reaction, almost to say that it seems as if the penalty side of the codes is far more amplified than the benefits to it. And so maybe let me come to yourself and ask, where's the good in this particular story? Where are companies essentially able now to really make strides in terms of their advancement of the empowerment agenda with the new codes?
I think the positive areas are that there's a lot more focus on skills development,
right,
thereby skilling black people, both employees and also people that weren't employed previously by the entity that we're looking at. And then furthermore, there's a lot of emphasis on enterprise development, tightening up on the requirements for enterprise development, some qualitative aspects around that. And then also, less emphasis around the employment equity aspects, but rather the bigger focus on skilling up employees and developing the competencies of employees.
I mean, enterprise development has become quite a buzzword. So how easy is it for SMMEs to become compliant? Is it becoming easier?
It's actually becoming more difficult. The companies between 10 and 50 million turnover now need to be measured on all the 5 elements, where previously they were only measured on 4 elements that each counted 25 points, and it was a lot easier to achieve a good scorecard. So it's definitely become a lot more difficult for smaller enterprises. And when it comes to the black-owned enterprises, there is a dispensation whereby a company that is has a black ownership of 100% and they've got a turnover of between 10 and 50 million, that they by default are level 1, which is the top scoring level. They do, however, still need to comply with an definition called empowering supplier, which is very much focused on localization, which on the one hand it's an upside, so it's a lot easier for a black-owned company to get a level 1, but they do, however, need to look at the empowering supplier aspect as well.
I mean, let me come back to you, Seth. I mean, I happened to be at that summit, and the president and the minister spoke a lot about cleaning up on the fronting game. How do the revised codes actually address fronting in BE?
I think the most direct address of fronting is within the revised BE Act, which is actually slightly separate to the codes of good practice, which are ancillary to that act. And basically the fronting has been criminalized explicitly within the Act with very severe penalties of up to 10 years imprisonment, up to 10% of a company's turnover being forfeited, and up to 10 years prohibition of trade with the state.
But is legislation then following these proposed amendments? Because I would think without the muscle to actually enforce any of that penalization, there's no point in making those statements.
You know, we haven't seen a huge change in terms of the implementation of the Act. We still struggle sometimes to get clarification on issues that are nebulous within the legislation, so we haven't seen a significant change there. The feeling generally is that if the market is taking these issues more seriously, and that if companies like our respective companies are held responsible for not blowing whistles, whistleblowing on fronting exercises, that people will start to be a little bit more interrogative when they are engaging with a company that may be fronting. So we hope that that will improve.
I think from my perspective, the issue of BE in South Africa is an elephant in a room in itself. And within there are various elements in the room. And one of those is the issue of monitoring. Now, there are so many guidelines that have been issued over the years, and only to be simply changed 10 years down the line because they weren't working. But actually we don't know if they weren't working because there was no monitoring to see actually what it is that's going wrong.
Absolutely.
Do we have the, you know, do we have the means to change things?
I think a big aspect about the codes is that there's a target as to what you need to put in or what you need to do, but there's no target as to how to measure the output or the quality of the effect and the impact of these initiatives.
Eric, I think just to latch onto your point, what worries me is that prior to the amendment, there's a very clear clause that would say after 5 years, the minister would review in terms of efficacy, and that's now come out. Is this creating uncertainty within the business environment that there isn't a very clear time frame for review?
Yeah, I think there's your question being that of when do we look at it and change it and fine-tune it. So we now know that it has been, it's not in effect yet, but it has been rearranged and there are new rules. There is a transition period of 1 year, which means we will start, it'll come into operation on the 11th of October of 2014.
Right.
How we apply that effective date is unclear within the industry, and that industry meaning both business and verification professionals. So there is a lot of uncertainty, not only as to when do we need to start measuring on this basis and when do we need to start implementing initiatives on this basis, but also the realignment of the existing targets and where we're shooting at in order to reach the expectations to the new expectations and the new targets and the new measurement methods.
But it also must be incredibly difficult for businesses to keep up to date and to know what's really going on. I mean, journalists, we struggle to stay abreast of the changes. So how do you keep your finger on the pulse?
We read a lot.
You go to all the summits?
Look, I'm glad because it gives us a job. And it certainly is very technical.
Right.
And I think the bigger challenge is that there are different interpretations, and the codes, the revised codes, have certain grey areas and conflicting definitions in different places. Now all of us need to go and apply this in practice, both companies and verification agencies and measurement companies. And with us looking from different angles, if we implement different interpretations, we're going to make it very difficult for business to implement this and to achieve the objectives that they designed to achieve.
Yeah.
I just wanted to jump in there that we encourage companies to be proactive about the process. So if a company employs, in our case, we advocate technology and as enabler. If a company is able to employ something like a system, an online system where they're able to gauge their compliance on an ongoing basis, then the technicalities of the codes can be built into those processes so that the end users don't have to be experts on the codes themselves.
I mean, particularly for SMMEs, they don't really have spare resources. So you mentioned technology. Is that the best way to stay abreast and to stay compliant? I
mean, you've got a number of options, being consulting, where you have a company come in and do calculations for you and report you back on those. Our approach is a consultative approach, but using a system that is within the domain of the user. So they would then control the system. And
unfortunately, Thandi, I'm going to have to ignore your little finger and close this discussion on that point of compliance. Thanks again to our guest, Seth Randall, Executive at Empowered, and Eric Ackroyd, Verification Director at Empower Logic. That's all we have for this week's edition of Finweek Money Matters. And it also remember that you can get your new edition of Finweek, which is available in stores today with a digital copy, also available in English and Afrikaans on mysubs.co.za. A special thanks, of course, to my co-hosts Tandisizwe Mahlutshana and Jessica Hubbard for reining in on the conversations today. From me, Nozi Pumbandre, and the team, we will see you again next week. Have a fantastic weekend.